The storm raged outside, but inside the dimly lit diner, an even greater battle was unfolding. She thought no one was watching when she slid the plate of food toward the boy, hungry, shivering, forgotten by the world. But someone did see, and that one small act of kindness was about to change her life forever, in ways she could never imagine. The neon glow of Mel's diner flickered against the darkened roadside, casting restless shadows over the nearly empty parking lot. It was the kind of place that had seen better days: faded vinyl seats, a jukebox that hadn't played in years, and a handful of regulars who had nowhere better to be. The bitter wind howled through the cracks in the door, and inside, Emma, a waitress in her late 30s, moved with quiet efficiency, refilling coffee mugs and clearing plates with a practiced hand. Life had never been kind to her, but she had learned to endure. With 2 kids at home, and a pile of overdue bills, there was no room for self-pity, only survival. As she wiped down the counter, the bell above the door chimed. She glanced up out of habit, expecting to see one of the usual truckers or late-night drifters. Instead, a man stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, and wrapped in an expensive wool coat that didn't belong in a place like this. His sharp blue eyes swept across the room, taking in every detail, every face. Something about him sent a ripple of unease through Emma, though she couldn't say why. He didn't look dangerous, just out of place, like a king who had wandered into a peasant's tavern. Before she could dwell on it, movement outside caught her attention. Across the street, half hidden in the shadows, a young girl stood shivering in the cold. She couldn't have been older than 12, her thin frame barely covered by an oversized hoodie. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, her breath forming fragile clouds in the night air. She wasn't begging, wasn't crying, just watching, waiting. Emma's stomach twisted. She had seen desperation before, had lived it. Every instinct screamed at her to look away, to mind her own business. She couldn't afford to help. She could barely keep herself afloat. But something in the girl's hollow gaze, the way she clung to the edge of the darkness, gnawed at her. The man in the wool coat followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he pulled a thick envelope from his pocket and set it on the counter. "For the girl," he said, his voice calm, certain. Emma stared at the envelope, at the crisp edges, and the weight of whatever was inside. Cash. A lot of it. Her pulse quickened. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled, but there was something tired behind it, something ancient. "Because once a stranger did the same for me." And with that he turned and walked back into the night, leaving Emma with a choice she never expected to make. As the last of the customers trickled out, and the diner settled into its late-night hush, Emma busied herself wiping down counters, but her mind remained elsewhere. Outside, beyond the glow of the flickering neon sign, the girl was still there, a fragile silhouette against the biting cold. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows across the empty parking lot, but she never moved, never wavered. Emma stole another glance. The girl's arms were wrapped tightly around herself, her breath coming in thin, ghostly wisps. Her shoes, if they could still be called that, were little more than scraps of fabric barely holding together. A pit formed in Emma's stomach. How long had she been standing there? And why hadn't she left? "Emma, you okay?" A voice snapped her out of her thoughts. It was Claire, her co-worker, leaning against the counter, arms crossed, watching her with mild curiosity. Emma hesitated, debating whether to say anything, but the words tumbled out anyway. "There's a girl outside," she murmured, nodding toward the window. "She's alone. I think she's homeless." Claire followed her gaze, barely sparing a second look before shrugging. "Happens. We get a few like that sometimes. They usually move on." Emma frowned. Move on to where? There was nothing out there but an empty stretch of highway, a gas station that closed hours ago, and miles of darkness beyond that. Something about this was wrong. The girl wasn't just loitering, she was waiting. For what? Emma found herself whispering. Claire sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Look, I get it. It's sad. But what can you do? You're not running a shelter. You start feeding one, they all start showing up." Emma wanted to argue, but the words stuck in her throat. Claire wasn't wrong. Life was cruel like that. People who had barely enough for themselves weren't supposed to care for others. But Emma had never been good at looking the other way. She had done it once before, years ago, and the regret still gnawed at her. She turned back toward the window. The girl had moved slightly, shifting from foot to foot, her fingers curled into tight fists against her sleeves. Every part of Emma screamed to stay out of it, to finish her shift, clock out, go home to her boys, and pretend she hadn't seen her. But she knew she wouldn't. She couldn't. Before she could think too much, she grabbed a clean plate and made her way toward the kitchen. The smell of fresh cornbread and slow-cooked stew filled the air, and without hesitation, she scooped a generous portion onto the plate. She added a roll on the side, a little extra butter, and hesitated only for a second before slipping a warm apple slice from the dessert tray onto the edge. It wasn't much, but it was something. "What's that for?" A gruff voice cut through her thoughts. Emma froze. Her boss, Ron, stood near the coffee station, arms crossed, watching her with a raised brow. She knew the rules. Food waste was a big no, and giving out free meals wasn't part of the job description. Customer changed their order. She lied smoothly, barely looking up. "Didn't want it," Ron grunted, his usual disinterest settling back into place. "Toss it then." Emma nodded, moving toward the back door instead. Her heart pounded, but she didn't stop. She stepped outside into the bitter cold, her breath a sharp mist in the air. The girl startled when she saw her, eyes wide, wary. Up close she looked even younger, maybe 10, maybe less, too young to be out here alone. Emma crouched down, holding out the plate. "Here," she said softly. "It's warm." The girl didn't move at first, staring at her like she wasn't sure if this was real. Then slowly, she reached out, fingers trembling, as she took the plate. Emma expected a thank you, or maybe a smile. But what she didn't expect, what sent a chill deeper than the cold night air, was the way the girl looked past her, toward the dark stretch of road behind the diner. Her expression shifted, not to relief, but to fear. And that's when Emma realized the girl hadn't been waiting for food. She had been running from something, something that was still out there, waiting. Emma barely noticed the sharp chill as she stepped out into the night, her thin uniform doing little to shield her from the biting wind. Her focus was entirely on the child before her, his frail figure half hidden in the shifting shadows of the parking lot. The neon glow from the diner's sign flickered against his pale face, his wide eyes locked onto the plate in her hands, as though unsure whether it was truly meant for him. "Hey, sweetheart," Emma said, crouching to his level, her voice gentle but firm. "You look hungry. This is for you." For a moment the boy didn't move. His fingers twitched against the frayed cuffs of his oversized jacket, his breath forming soft clouds in the freezing air. His eyes darted past Emma toward the darkened street beyond, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Emma felt a pang of unease. She had expected hesitation, maybe shyness, but this was something else. This was fear. "It's okay," she assured him, her own breath shaky in the cold. "You don't have to say anything. Just take it." Slowly his small hands reached forward, trembling as they brushed against the warm ceramic plate. He cradled it against his chest, as though it were something precious, something that could be taken from him at any moment. His lips parted slightly, but no words came, only a single nod, a silent acknowledgement of her kindness. Emma swallowed hard, fighting the lump rising in her throat. "You can eat it here," she offered, nodding toward the diner. "Inside where it's warm." At that the boy's expression changed, panic flashing across his features like a struck match. He shook his head quickly, taking an unsteady step backward, his thin frame swallowed deeper into the night. "Wait," Emma whispered, her heart pounding. She wanted to ask where he was staying, if he had someone waiting for him, if he needed more than just this one meal. But something stopped her, a gut feeling, a warning. The boy turned and disappeared into the darkness. She remained frozen, staring after him, long after his small figure had faded into the night. The sense of helplessness hit her harder than she expected. She had done something, but it didn't feel like enough. She exhaled, forcing herself to shake off the chill before stepping back inside. The warmth of the diner wrapped around her, but it did little to ease the growing unease in her chest. She hadn't noticed the man sitting in the farthest corner of the diner, the one who had watched everything. He stirred slightly, tapping his fingers against his untouched coffee, his sharp eyes never leaving Emma. He had seen it all, and unlike her, he knew exactly why the boy had been there, and why he was running. The clatter of dishes, the low hum of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter, it all blended into the familiar symphony of the late-night diner. Mia moved through it on autopilot, clearing plates, wiping down tables, refilling salt shakers and ketchup bottles, and yet the feeling never left her. Someone was watching her. She could sense it, the way the air seemed to shift whenever she passed by the farthest booth in the corner. The man sitting there had been in the diner for over an hour, speaking to no one, barely touching his coffee. He wasn't a regular. He wasn't a trucker, stopping for a quick bite or a tired traveler looking for caffeine. Before hitting the road again, he was something else. His presence wasn't imposing, but it was deliberate. He dressed simply, a dark coat, pressed shirt, polished shoes, nothing remarkable, and yet something about him set off a quiet alarm in Mia's mind. Maybe it was the way he sat, too still, too composed, like a man who was used to watching and waiting. Or maybe it was his eyes, sharp, unwavering, calculating. She had caught his gaze more than once, and each time, a strange unease settled in her stomach. He wasn't just looking at her, he was studying her. As she cleared a table near his booth, he moved just slightly, raising a hand in a slow, deliberate motion. The kind of motion someone makes when they don't want to startle. Mia hesitated, then approached, her notepad poised in reflex. "Can I get you something else?" she asked, keeping her tone light, professional. The man looked up at her, a small unreadable smile on his lips. "No thank you." His voice was smooth, calm, but there was an edge to it, something careful. "I just wanted to say, what you did out there." He paused, as if weighing his words. "That was a beautiful thing." Mia's breath caught. The boy, the plate of food. She had thought no one had noticed. "Oh," she said, forcing a casual shrug. "It wasn't a big deal." The man tilted his head slightly, studying her the way someone might study a puzzle with missing pieces. "Most people would have walked away," he said. "But you didn't." Mia shifted on her feet. "He was just a kid. He needed a meal. That's all." "That's not all," the man countered, his voice quiet, but firm. "You saw someone who needed help, and you gave what you could." Even though, he let the sentence linger in the air, unfinished, but heavy with meaning. "Even though you don't have much to spare." Mia stiffened, her grip tightening on her notepad. How did he know that? She forced a smile, trying to shake the strange weight of his words. "It was just dinner," she said lightly, taking a small step back. "Excuse me, I should get back to work." But as she turned away, she felt it again, that unwavering stare. The air around her suddenly felt different, charged with something she couldn't quite name. And for the first time that night, Mia had the unsettling feeling that she wasn't the one watching a mystery unfold. She was part of it. Mia forced a polite smile, the unease still lingering in the back of her mind. "Well, I should get back to work. Let me know if you need anything else." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "What's your name?" She hesitated. A simple question, but coming from him, it felt loaded. After a pause, she answered, "Mia." A slow, knowing smile touched his lips. "Thank you, Mia." His voice was low, calm yet oddly weighted. "You're a rare kind of person." Something about the way he said it sent a strange chill down her spine. Not out of fear, but something else, something unplaceable. She busied herself with the rest of her shift, but her mind kept drifting back to that man, to his words, to the way he had watched her. He was too composed, too observant, not in a way that felt threatening, but as if he had been deliberately waiting for something, watching for something. By the time the night wore on, and the last few customers trickled out, Mia finally turned toward his booth again. The seat was empty. She hadn't even noticed him leave. Yet when she went to clear his table, she found something that made her breath hitch, a crisp envelope, half tucked beneath the plate. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked it up and unfolded the note inside. Neat, deliberate handwriting. Kindness is a rare gift in this world. You gave without expecting anything in return. That is the kind of spirit that changes lives. Don't lose it. Mia read it twice, then a third time, her heart pounding in her chest. The words felt heavy, purposeful, but there was no signature, no way to tell who had written it, who he really was, and yet somehow, she knew it was him. She swallowed, tucking the note into her apron pocket, trying to shake the strange feeling that had taken root inside her, a feeling that something much larger than a simple act of kindness had just been set into motion. Outside, under the glow of a flickering street lamp, the man stood for a moment, watching the diner from the cold shadows. His breath misted in the frigid air as he turned up the collar of his coat, his mind deep in thought. His name was not one Mia would have recognized. Not yet, but in certain circles, Victor Hayes was more than a name. He was a force. A man who had built an empire from nothing. A man who had seen the darkest parts of humanity and survived them. And a man who had learned, through his own scars, that the rarest kind of power didn't come from money or influence. It came from people like Mia, people who still believed in goodness. He hadn't planned to stop at this small roadside diner, but fate had a way of leading him to the people who mattered most. And tonight, he had found someone worth watching. Because what Mia didn't know yet, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that her life had already begun to change, and soon it would never be the same again. Victor Hayes hadn't planned to stop. The long stretch of highway was familiar. Another nameless road cutting through the quiet outskirts of a town he had no reason to remember. His schedule was tight, meetings, negotiations, commitments that never seemed to end. But as the glow of neon flickered through the windshield, something in him hesitated. Not for the food, not for rest, something else. So he pulled over. Inside the diner, the world felt smaller. The hum of an old jukebox, the clatter of plates, the low murmur of tired conversations. Life here moved at a different rhythm, slower, real. He had spent years surrounded by opulence, men in suits who measured their worth in power, their success in digits, but here in this unassuming place, people simply existed, lived. From the shadowed corner of the booth, he had watched. The waitress, Mia as he had later learned, moved through the space like she had been built for it, not in the effortless way of someone born to serve, but in the quiet resilience of someone who had no choice but to keep moving. She smiled, despite the exhaustion on her face. She greeted every customer, as if they mattered, as if they were more than just another plate to clear, another tip to chase. And then there was the boy. Victor saw the moment she noticed him, the way her body tensed just slightly before softening. He had seen that look before, the recognition of hunger, of cold, of a kind of loneliness that clung to the bones. It was the same look that had once stared back at him from dirty shop windows and alleyway puddles. The same look he had carried for years in the foster system, waiting, hoping, expecting nothing. But Mia, she had acted. No hesitation, no second thoughts. She had prepared that plate with the kind of careful attention most reserved for those they loved. She hadn't looked for praise, hadn't even checked to see if anyone had noticed. But he had noticed. Victor had met presidents, had shaken hands with the wealthiest, the most powerful. He had built empires with men who commanded industries, and yet in all those encounters, he had never been as profoundly moved as he was by this one moment. A tired waitress giving what little she had to a child, who had even less. Outside, the cold hit sharper than before. His driver had already pulled the car around, the sleek black vehicle a stark contrast against the cracked pavement of the parking lot. But Victor didn't move. Not yet. He stood there, hands in his coat pockets, staring back at the diner's warm glow. Something churned in him, an idea forming in the quiet. He had built his fortune believing in grand gestures, in sweeping change, in the power of wealth to transform lives on a massive scale. But tonight he was reminded of a truth far greater. Sometimes it wasn't about the world. Sometimes it was about one person. Mia didn't know it yet. She had no idea that in the span of a single night, her life had changed, that a man with resources beyond imagination had decided, in a single breath, to do for her what no one had done for him. Victor exhaled, watching his breath curl into the night air. Then with quiet certainty, he got into the car, and as they drove off into the darkness, a plan had already taken root. The car pulled away from the diner, its taillights dissolving into the darkness, but Victor's thoughts remained fixed on what he had witnessed. His grip on his phone tightened. The feeling gnawed at him. This wasn't just another passing encounter. This was something more. He flipped open his laptop, his fingers moving with precision as he sent a message to his assistant. Find out everything. The waitress, the boy, their lives, their struggles, their needs. No public attention, no media. This is personal. The next morning his assistant, Evelyn, called promptly. Her voice was composed, professional as always, but there was something in her tone, an unspoken weight behind the word. Her name is Mia Brooks, 27, single mother, works double shifts at the diner to support her daughter Lily, 7 years old, barely making ends meet, but she keeps a clean record, no loans, no legal trouble, just struggling. Victor exhaled sharply. He had expected hardship, but hearing it made it real. And the boy? A pause. That's more complicated. No records, no school enrollment, no family ties in the area. I ran his face through missing persons databases. Nothing. He's completely off the grid. Victor's jaw clenched. A child without an identity. That more than anything struck a nerve. He had been there once. A name on a case file, a shadow moving through the system. Unnoticed, unclaimed. He wouldn't let it happen to this boy. I want to meet her, he said. His voice steady. Arrange it, quietly. Evelyn hesitated. This isn't how you usually operate. Victor leaned back in his chair, staring out over the city skyline. Deals, contracts, philanthropy at scale. He was used to thinking big. But this wasn't about scale. This was about something deeper. Some things aren't meant for headlines, he murmured. This one's personal. Mia's morning was like any other. Wake up before dawn. Pack Lily's lunch. Hurry out the door. She barely had time to think about the mysterious note from the night before. Life demanded too much of her to dwell on small mysteries. But the mystery found her. She was on her break, sipping lukewarm coffee in the diner's back room, when she noticed the car. It was sleek, black, and utterly out of place. Tinted windows, engine too smooth for something local, a vehicle that didn't belong in a town like this. The door opened. Mia's breath caught as Victor Hayes stepped out, dressed in the same effortless sophistication as before. But now there was something different. A purpose in his step, a weight in his presence. He walked through the diner's entrance, the hum of conversation dulling as he approached. The way he carried himself, calm, deliberate, unwavering, sent a ripple of unease through her. Not fear. Something else. Recognition. Mia swallowed hard as he stopped before her. Mia's, he said, his voice smooth, unreadable. A pause. The weight of his presence pressed down on her, and she realized this wasn't a coincidence. He hadn't just come back for coffee. He had come back for her. Mia hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen where her boss was now openly staring. The diner's usual hum of conversation had dulled, the weight of Victor Hayes' presence shifting the atmosphere. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. Sure, she stammered, wiping her hands on her apron. She led him to a booth near the back, each step feeling heavier under the weight of curious stares. The moment they sat, Victor wasted no time. What you did last night was extraordinary, he said, his voice low but intense. You didn't just feed that boy. You saw him. You gave him dignity when the world had forgotten him. Mia's shifted uncomfortably. Compliments from customers weren't unusual, but this felt different. Too precise, too personal. It wasn't a big deal, she murmured. I just did what anyone would do. Victor's eyes darkened. as if the words genuinely pained him. That's where you're wrong. Most people wouldn't. He leaned forward slightly. That's why I'm here, to make sure your kindness doesn't go unnoticed. He reached into his coat, pulling out a folded piece of paper. The moment he placed it on the table, Mia felt her stomach twist. Slowly she unfolded it. Her breath hitched. A check. The number staring back at her wasn't just generous. It was life-changing. Her vision blurred for a moment. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice unsteady. Why are you doing this? Victor's gaze didn't waver. Because someone once did the same for me. His voice was steady, but there was something raw beneath it. When I was a boy, not much older than the one you helped, a stranger saw something in me. When no one else did, they gave me a chance, a way out, and I've never forgotten that. Mia blinked rapidly, her fingers tightening around the paper. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Victor said gently. Just promise me you'll use it to build the life you and your daughter deserve. Her breath shuddered as she nodded, emotions swirling too fast to process, but Victor wasn't finished. He leaned back, his expression shifting. Something sharper now, more determined. There's one more thing. Mia's pulse quickened. That boy you helped, Victor continued, his voice quieter now. I want to make sure he's okay too. I've already had my team start looking. He exhaled, as if calculating his next words carefully. I need your help. Mia frowned. I don't know anything about him. He just showed up. Victor studied her, his gaze unrelenting. Then we'll find him. A chill ran down Mia's spine, though she wasn't sure why. Something about this felt bigger than what it seemed, and for the first time she wondered, who exactly was Victor Hayes? And why did she feel like her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even begin to understand? Mia's breath hitched. You found him. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, as if saying it out loud might shatter the fragile hope swelling in her chest. Victor's eyes held steady. He's safe, and he will stay that way, thanks to you. Mia exhaled, her hands trembling slightly as they clutched the edge of the table. The weight of the past few days bore down on her. How a single night, a single act of kindness, had unraveled into something much larger than she ever expected. What happens now? She asked, uncertain. Victor leaned back, his gaze unwavering. That depends on you. My team has located his next of kin, a relative in a nearby town. We can arrange for them to take him in, but if you want to be involved, I'll make sure you are. A wave of emotions crashed over Mia. She barely knew the boy, but something deep inside her refused to let go. She had seen too many people slip through the cracks, too many names become statistics. This time she wanted it to be different. I want to help, she said, surprising even herself. Victor gave a small nod, as if he had expected that answer all along. And just like that, her world shifted. In the weeks that followed, Mia's life transformed in ways she never imagined. The check Victor had given her wasn't just money, it was freedom. It meant no longer dragging herself through endless shifts at the diner, no longer calculating every grocery bill to the last cent. It meant finally daring to dream. With Victor's quiet assistance, she secured a small space on the corner of Main Street, a sunlit shop with old brick walls and a history as rich as the scent of fresh bread that would soon fill it. Mia's bakery, the dream she had tucked away for so many years, was now real. And the boy, Victor's team had done more than just find him. They had given him a name, a history, and a future. He was no longer just a shadow slipping through alleyways, forgotten by the world. He had a place now, a relative who had stepped forward after believing he was lost forever. Through it all, Victor remained a presence in Mia's life, never overbearing, never seeking recognition. He watched from the sidelines, ensuring everything fell into place, ensuring that the ripples of one cold winter night continued to spread. One evening, as Mia tucked Lily into bed, she found herself staring at her daughter's peaceful face, the weight of gratitude pressing against her ribs. It wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about opportunity, it was about something deeper, proof that kindness, no matter how small, could alter the course of fate. In the quiet of her living room, she picked up her journal, a habit she had started recently. She flipped to a fresh page, her pen hovering for a moment before she scribbled down a thought. No act of kindness is ever wasted. Sometimes it's the smallest gesture that changes everything. And as she sat there listening to the faint hum of life outside her window, she realized something. This wasn't just her story. It was a reminder to anyone willing to listen, because out there someone else was waiting for a stranger's kindness to change their world.